Welcome to the Duckpin Podcast with your host, Brian Griffiths. And now, here's Brian.
It may not be in a major election year in the United States, but our friends north of the border are having a major election, and it's coming up a lot sooner than you think. September 20th, Canadians will go to the polls in order to select their new parliament and possibly a new prime minister. Joining us, we figured that to talk about this election, we bring an expert on Canada and Canadian elections. We brought in Rob Towner. Rob, thanks for joining us on this week's show.
Brian, it's an absolute pleasure here.
Rob is actually joining us from his car because when we went to tape this, he didn't have power in his place. So he is going the extra mile here to join us on this week's show. I think the best question a lot of people are going to want to know is, why is a guy from the United States, why do you love Canada so much? Why do you know so much about Canada?
Well, thank you again, Brian, for having me on this week. I always loved telling this story. It was November of 2000. We're right in the middle of Bush v. Gore, and it was right around Thanksgiving and my 16th birthday. Most people get a driver's license for their 16th birthday. I got my tonsils removed. So while I was stuck in my bedroom because it was so sore to swallow anything that I couldn't even have the food processed turkey that my mom tried to give me as an act of gratitude, I'm flipping around the TV because I'm sick of watching all of this about, hanging chads in Palm Beach County and, all this ridiculousness. I flip on C-SPAN and I see what looks like a debate that's out of 1985. And it is the CBC's English language prime minister's debate for the leaders for the 2000 election that took place at the end of November. An election that Jean Chrétien, the leader of the Liberal Party, would go on to win a very convincing majority government. But it was just fascinating seeing all of the different party leaders there, the New Democrats that are further to the left than the Liberals, the Bloc Québécois, the Nationalist Party for the French language, the Canadian Alliance, and the Progressive Conservatives. And just being able to see, wait a second, we don't know anything about Canada. There's just this little country of 25, 30 million people that punches above their weight with music and entertainment. So why not start paying a little more attention? And from there, I began following the provincial elections. I began following the leadership races. I began understanding the nuances between the different parties. And I'm proud to say that, one of my, hobbies over the last 20 years, that's probably completely useless on this side of the border, is being able to provide that expertise on all things Canadian politics.
Hey, it got you on this show this week. It was a good reason to have you on this week. A lot of people probably aren't even really aware the differences between the American style of government and the Canadian style of government. Canada's got what's called a Westminster style of government, where there's a prime minister and the members of parliament. Unlike the House of Lords over in the United Kingdom, they do have a Senate, which is appointed and does share a similar lack of power, if you will, compared to the House of Commons in Canada. But what's fascinating, and you touched on it here, is the fact that Canada is not a two-party system by any stretch of the imagination. There are 5 major parties that have seats in Parliament in the House of Commons right now. And so how does that kind of change the calculus of things? For those who don't know, there's the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party, but there's also the New Democratic Party, there's the Green Party, and there's the Bloc Québécois. How does the dynamic of that all shift, especially when you consider that of the 4 national parties, I don't count the Bloc in there, you have 3 that are on the left side of the ledger, whereas there's only 1 right-leaning party. So how does all of this interplay actually kind of come together when we start talking about these elections in these individual districts, which are called ridings in Canada?
I think that when you take a look, even within those parties at the federal election level, the the MPs that are, party members, they do a good enough job of allowing them to sell the platforms that they have. So, if you're a new Democrat in some place like Windsor, Ontario, very union centric, very factory centric, it's going to be a very different kind of message that your MPs or your candidates in those ridings are going to be selling compared to somebody in Halifax, Nova Scotia, where rent control is the big issue, and in fact was the big issue in the most recent provincial election a few weeks ago. And I think that with the Conservatives, that was a situation where it used to be two split parties between a much more what we would consider American conservative style party that was predominant in the western part of Canada, and a more red Tory or moderate conservative party from Ontario eastward. And even though those parties are now under one umbrella, and I think that somebody like Stephen Harper, the former prime minister, it takes somebody like that that can speak both languages. You also have to be a strong enough leader to trust your candidates that are appointed at the local level to understand, hey, we can all ride under this banner, regardless of what party, but we're going to be able to convey that message in our riding without having the massive oversight of, the party leader. And that's actually a big part of why this election's so fascinating. Justin Trudeau, the leader of the Liberal Party and the current prime minister, he is very much somebody who appreciates that larger than life personality of being the leader, whereas the other party leaders, they're visible, but they trust in their individual members in those ridings to be able to convey the message.
Yeah, and Trudeau, of course, has the added benefit of being Pierre Trudeau's son, who was the prime minister back in the 1980s as well. And you mentioned the Conservative Party and how back in the early 2000s, there was a more Eastern conservative, progressive conservative party, and the more Western Republican style, if you will, Canadian Alliance, and that Stephen Harper brought those two sides together, and that's that kind of East-West dynamic, not necessarily based on ideology, but on the Ontario interests in East versus the Western provinces. I mean, that goes back all the way to the Diefenbaker days. It's
Absolutely.
back in the PC days. How much of that still exists now? I mean, the two parties have reunited. They've been back together for a while. I know we've seen other parties where two different conservative parties kind of came together. We saw the PCs and Wild Rose merge to create the United Conservative Party in Alberta. How much of that division is still there between the more Western interests, that more conservative, Western Republican style interests, and the Eastern style establishment Tories? How much of that still exists in the modern Conservative Party?
Well, I think that within the Conservative Party of Canada, that's not necessarily an issue, but I think there are certainly elements that are casting a protest candidacy this time around. In Alberta and Saskatchewan, as a matter of fact, there are 27 what they would call safe conservative ridings, where you don't have to worry about vote splitting that the Liberals or the New Democrats are going to come in, that an upstart party by the name of the Maverick Party is actually running candidates in. And the Maverick Party was an offshoot of what's called the Wexit movement. It wasn't truly a West wants out of Canada situation like we've seen with the Bloc Québécois from a nationalist standpoint. It was more the West wants representation. The way that the ridings are set up in Canada based on population, the fact that provinces are doled out transfer payments for equalization so that no province is necessarily left behind. When you're an oil or a natural resources strong province like Saskatchewan, like Alberta, you feel resentful when you're taking a look and seeing that Atlantic Canada, where Newfoundland and Labrador needed a $5 trillion bailout. I have to take a look for a hydroelectric dam project that went very, very badly. The Ottawa was able to come on in and help support and prop them up while saying, Alberta, we're going to take away your oil and gas. We're going to make it more difficult for you. There's a resentment factor. And while I don't think it's going to cause another schism on the right of center, I think that you will see movements like the Maverick Party, like Maxime Bernier's People's Party. I think you're going to see those crop up from time to time as a bullhorn more than any actual punch to the face, so to speak.
I mean, do you think, Alberta has kind of a tendency in the past. They've taken some wild swings in the past towards electing parties that have just kind of come out of nowhere. We saw that with the United Farmers of Alberta, followed up directly by Social Credit, and they stayed in power for 25 years in their provincial government. So what are the chances, particularly in Alberta, but in any of these places where a upstart party comes around? What are the chances that we see 4 or 5 of those seats go to parties that are not currently represented in Parliament?
Well, I think it comes down to personality. I think that the best chance that we saw of that happening in the last 10 years was actually with the Green Party. I think that the former leader of the Green Party, Elizabeth May, she did an outstanding job of helping to bring that party up to prominence and be able to say, we're not trying to be the NDP, we're not trying to be the Liberals, we're certainly not trying to be the Conservatives, but we're going to have enough flavor to bring folks over that would otherwise consider the Greens as their second choice to mark us as their first. And in a first past the post system, if you're able to get enough people to sway or make those strategic votes, then you have an opportunity to get 2 or 3 seats across the ridings. Now, it's unfortunate the current party leader of the Greens, a wonderful young woman who is in Toronto. There's been some very difficult schisms within the party. And in fact, one of their MPs out of New Brunswick, who was elected, actually switched over to the Liberal Party due to some issues around the party leader and her Israel stance compared to where party members are.
Yeah, and that leader is Annamie Paul, and she is the first Black Canadian to be elected the leader of a party, and she's also the first Jewish Canadian to lead a federal party. And as we've seen, the Green Party in the United States has a very peculiar quandary with Israel, as I'm sure the Canadian Green Party does as well. The left not really big fans of Israel, and she, for obvious reasons, is more sympathetic to Israel. One of the things we haven't touched on yet is why Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister, called this election in the first place. Unlike the United States, we know exactly when elections are going to be, today, tomorrow, 25 years from now. The Prime Minister in Canada has a little bit of wiggle room to ask the Governor General, who is the vice-regal representative of the Queen in right of Canada, which is Queen Elizabeth, can ask for a dissolution of Parliament, which the Governor General gave the Prime Minister in order to have this election. It'll be just over 2 years since the last time the Canadians went to the polls. That result was in a coalition government. The Liberals did not quite have enough to form a majority government, but they were able to scrounge together the votes to keep Trudeau as the Prime Minister. So why then did Trudeau call an election now and not wait until later on, or until he was required by law to call another election?
Brian, that's a question that Canadians actually have been asking themselves since this election was called. And the best answer that people have been able to come up with is that Justin Trudeau got tired of 2 years of minority government, and he saw the opportunity to be able to win enough seats to be able to hold a majority government that would allow for him to go up to 4 or 5 years before having to call another election. Now, unfortunately, COVID is still very much something that has impacted Canadians. And on a province to province level, yes, there have been some benefits that have been given out. Yes, there have been some pays, to small business and what have you. But there's a lot going on for Canadians, and there's a lot of quality of life issues that are making them ask, why are we going to the polls just because the prime minister wants his party to get a majority? And if you look at some of the recent polls, it's not been a very strong kickoff to the election for Justin Trudeau and the Liberals. There's been a lot of mixed messaging and a lot of hesitation from voters, particularly in those key districts and ridings in suburban Toronto, in places like Hamilton, Ontario, which is looking more and more like the bellwether for this election. That people are just saying, you haven't really done enough to earn a majority yet. We're shopping around. We're listening to Aaron O'Toole, the leader of the Conservative Party. We're listening to Jagmeet Singh of the New Democrats. And, maybe the debates will change. Maybe some new issue will pop up. But as of right now, if you ask and you take a look at some of the great, columnists and political strategists, Warren Kinsella, if you haven't paid attention to him, this is a man who was very much in tune with Canadian politics, served under Jean Chrétien. If he's saying people are not understanding what this election is really about, you have to think it's not going to be a slam dunk for Trudeau.
Yeah, obviously I'm paying attention, not as much as you are, but even when I look at the campaign slogans here for each of the parties, and each of the parties has come up with a specific slogan. For the Conservative, it's time for you to get ahead. New Democrats, it's in it for you. Liberal Party, choose forward, which I can't. I mean, that doesn't even mean anything. The Green Party, as you mentioned, trying to appeal to everybody, not left, not right, forward, together. The People's Party, which is kind of the far right party, strong and free. And the Bloc Québécois, of course, does not have an English slogan because they only compete in ridings in Quebec. And kind of explain that to people who may not understand that. I mean, you don't see a situation in the United States other than a weird thing like Lowell Wicker in 1990 running in a one-state party trying to, or Connecticut for Lieberman or something like that. A one state, one province, in this case, party that has basically one specific issue, which of course is Québécois independence. Explain the Bloc, to folks, and kind of explain how much of an impact it really has on federal politics.
So the Bloc Québécois was a federal offshoot out of protest from some of the former progressive conservatives in Quebec. In the late 1980s, early 1990s, when you were seeing some constitutional things popping up. In Canada, their most recent constitution was ratified in 1982, and all of the provinces except for Quebec signed on to the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. During the Brian Mulroney era, there was supposed to be a buttoning up of that, the Meek Lake Accords. Almost think of that as being, some of the constitutional amendments that would have satisfied and placated. That unfortunately blew up in its face and led to, dominoes falling that would bring us to the 1995 Quebec referendum, where, it was almost as close as the 2000 Florida election in terms of Quebec remaining within Canadian Confederation instead of going independent. And with the Bloc, it's very interesting because there's a lot of things where you would think that you can't really box them into being left or right. And in fact, they tend to follow the winds of whoever the provincial party is that's in power. And in Canada, the provincial political parties are completely separate from the federal political parties. But, Quebec, they're a little unusual. And currently, the provincial party in power in Quebec is an upstart, pseudo-populist party. There are certain things that it's socially liberal on, but other things where it's very socially nationalist on. And so when the Bloc's not running for Quebec independence, they're running for Quebec interests and strength and representation. And I think that when you look, there is still some signs of diversity within politics. In Montreal, The NDP got a foothold a few years ago, and they still have one or two ridings where they're solidly the Conservatives. They're very strong in and around Quebec City and out into the countryside up there. But there's a large swath of southern and western Quebec where it's between the Liberals and the Bloc, not from a left-right standpoint, but from an Anglo-Franco standpoint. And that's always going to be an issue when it comes to the Bloc.
Yeah, that southwestern part of Quebec, people, I think, forget. Southwestern Quebec is a lot more English speaking and Anglo-centric than a lot of people remember, much in the same way that parts of far eastern Ontario is more Franco-centric than a lot of people remember. And of course, there was that one time, 30 years or so ago, where the Bloc was the official opposition to the loyal opposition, official opposition to Her Majesty's government, which is always kind of a hoot to remember. Especially when you consider that they spent most of their time on Quebec nationalist issues and kind of punted to the Reform Party on everything else. But, the last time, as I said, the last time Trudeau called an election in 2019, he had a majority going into the election and then lost that majority and had to form that coalition government in order to stay in power. What do you think? Just kind of your kind of back of the napkin analysis here a couple weeks out. Do you think Trudeau overplayed his hand? You mentioned a lot of people don't really understand why this election has been called. Do you think that, Trudeau is going to be in for a rude awakening?
Right now, with the polls showing, and again, this is before debates have occurred, this is before we've seen an amping up, because just like in American politics, people aren't paying attention until after Labor Day. You're going on vacation, you're going to the lakes. If you've been on some sort of lockdown or restrictions, you're enjoying the fact that you can actually go out and do stuff for the first time in several months or over a year. I think that until Justin Trudeau and the Liberal Party can come up with a convincing reason why, after 6 years in power, 4 of which were a majority government, that he still has work to do, it becomes very tempting to listen. I think that the New Democrats and Jagmeet Singh have done an outstanding job in the first 2 weeks of the campaign. I think Aaron O'Toole with the Conservatives, getting their platform out and making sure that people see exactly what they're looking for in the Conservatives, that was a mistake that was made in 2019. And I think O'Toole, he has an outstanding cast that's running the campaign that is making sure that he will not trip over some of those issues. And, if you want to win in places like what's called the 905 region, suburban Toronto, you want to pay attention to those ridings in places like Halton region and Peel region, which are very much like the Loudoun County, Virginia, and Fairfax County, Virginia of Canada. One website that I go to and have been going to for the last 20 years to look at a riding by riding level is called electionprediction.org. It is a crowdsourced website where you can go in and see exactly what people are saying in each of these ridings, and being able to look at the historical information for those ridings to see just how close those polls are, what the candidates' issues were, how they were successful, and if they ended up winning last time. And for it being crowdsourced, when election predictions come down to it and made those calls, they've been on average about 90% right. And so that's my go-to. And for anybody who wants to nerd out on Canadian politics and see things at that granular of a level, I can't recommend electionprediction.org enough.
One thing that we did overlook that we brought up during that remarks right there, I think it's important to note, is the campaign itself. And campaign season in Canada is not anything like it is in the United States. They have an official campaign period. They're only allowed to do certain activities during certain times. So explain to people, it's not this drawn out thing. People have not been campaigning like people airdropping into Iowa and New Hampshire already for the 2024 election. There's a certain time period where they're allowed to do things. So kind of explain that campaign period and what that means to both the voter and to the parties.
So once an election is called, which at the federal level is when Parliament dissolves, Prime Minister goes to the Governor General and says, I would like to go ahead and call an election. There is a range, and that election period can be anywhere from in the low 30s in terms of number of days, all the way up to potentially 50 days. So you're talking about compressing a lot into a month to 45-day period. And so, there's always those tea leaves that an election might be coming. People are always trying to look for the play that something's going to be happening. Prime Minister's going out, making more speeches out on the stump. Key cabinet officials are going out and making, statements around funding or what have you, or policies. But as soon as that election is called, the party apparatuses are going off to town, and it is just, it's like running the Kentucky Derby. This is not a marathon or a triathlon. This is you need to be on your toes. You need to be quick. And, those 35, 45 days are going to be gone just like that.
Yeah, I'm sure there's a lot of voters in the United States who are very jealous of our Canadian friends for having everything compressed in such a time period. One of the things to kind of compare Canada and Britain here for a second. In 1974, Edward Heath was the Prime Minister of Great Britain. Harold Wilson, excuse me. God, Edward Heath was the Conservative leader. Harold Wilson was the Prime Minister of Great Britain, the Labour Party. He called an election where he thought he was going to get a majority in February of 1974. Didn't quite work out the way he thought it was. They had to go to the polls again 8 months later to do it all over again. And that had a lot to do with, lack of confidence votes and a lot of other stuff that may not necessarily be in play here. What's the chances that something like that happens where nobody gets a majority and Canada has to do call another election a lot sooner than anybody would probably prefer?
Well, believe it or not, that actually happened 5 years after what you described with Justin Trudeau's father. Joe Clark and the Progressive Conservatives won a minority government in 1979. It barely lasted a year, and Pierre Trudeau was able to win a year later, because when you're running a minority government, you have to depend on all of your other parties to get things passed, and they can make it a confidence vote. If you fail on even one of those confidence votes, then the government's dissolved and you've got to call up an election. Now, in terms of calling an election that you think you have in the bag and that and then you end up getting surprised, just look at the Nova Scotia Provincial Elections earlier this month. The Liberal Party in Nova Scotia had been in power for, I believe, 15 years across 3 different Liberal Party leaders. And even though they had a new party leader, they thought they had this in the bag. Well, the Progressive Conservative Party of Nova Scotia ended up having a very charismatic leader and made a singular focus out of healthcare. Something like 50, 60,000 people in Nova Scotia that do not have a primary care physician. Emergency rooms have to close early if you're outside of Halifax because they simply do not have enough doctors or staff. And you may have to end up going the next city or next county over for emergency care. And the PCs tapped into that. They said, we're going to fund this. We're going to make sure that we spend money on it because this is what's important to the people. And even though the polls were saying it was going to be razor close between the Liberals and the PCs ended up pulling out 30, 31 seats and gaining a majority. First time in 15 years. And so that should, even though, again, the provincial parties are very different from the federal parties, there's still a lot of people that were working on that PC race for Nova Scotia that are part of Team Aaron O'Toole. And I have no doubt in my mind, you're going to see some of that matriculate back into Ottawa and be part of the federal discussion. And if I'm Justin Trudeau, where Atlantic Canada is supposed to be a bedrock for Liberal votes, I'm starting to get a little bit concerned that it might not be as easy as a jump off as it has been the last 2 elections for him.
So I pulled up the election. This is the last question I've got for you, then we'll get you out of here. I pulled up the electionprediction.org information for this election, the prediction right now. And the current prediction is Liberal 112, Conservative 99, NDP 18, the Bloc 22, the Green Party 1, and too close to call 86. That's definitely, if that's the information is to be believed, that's definitely not looking like anybody's getting a majority here. You got to get to 170 to get a majority. And, either the Conservatives or the Liberals would have to win quite a lot of those seats in order to get a majority. So I'll put you on the spot here. Who's the winner and what number do they win? With number of seats, that is.
I think that unless the Liberals can give people in Southern Ontario, Quebec, the Atlantic provinces a convincing reason to vote for them, I think you have an opportunity for the New Democrats to be able to cause some vote splitting in urban regions. And I think in the suburbs, you may see some surprises. If you're looking into Ontario, pay attention to York region, Halton region, and Durham region, because those are going to be where you have those three-way splits. And that is going to be where the elections are won or lost. I think that right now, Aaron O'Toole is playing enough of a campaign that I will say I don't think the Liberals are going to get a majority government, but I also would not be prepared to make a prediction that the Conservatives would be able to form government, or that the Liberals and NDP or the Greens would be able to coalesce together. So the prediction I'm willing to make is I don't think the Liberals get to 170, but I think that it's going to be very interesting, because the real fun then starts after election night to see who can form government and who can cow trade with the other parties to try to make a working coalition.
The Belgium answer. Okay, that'll be very interesting, and definitely if it gets to that point and somebody has that few seats, I can definitely I can definitely see an election 6 months down the road again for our friends up north. Rob, if people want to follow you on social media, follow your take on all things Canadian politics, how can they do that?
They can follow me. My socials on Instagram and Twitter is @Wikimapper. And I'll always be retweeting, following, and providing great insight, because as much as I know, I'm following and learning from so many other people that are on the ground up there, left, right, and in between. And, anybody that wants to be educated, I'm happy to go ahead and guide you in the right direction.
Rob Towner, he knows a lot about Canada. Thanks for joining us in this week's show. We'll have you on again soon to talk about maybe after the election. We'll talk about some other stuff too.
I appreciate that, Brian. Always a pleasure.
All right, Rob, take care.
This has been the Duckpin Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe and download.